Gary Stearman here, welcoming you to another episode of Prophecy in the News. And by the way, today we still have a couple of very, very expert guests. They are both authors. Tom Horn on my right, L.A. Marzulli on my left. They've authored many books, which we're offering to you right here on Prophecy in the News. Gary Stearman with another exciting edition of Prophecy in the News. We have with us again two highly acclaimed authors, and one on my right, Tom Horn, on my left, L.A. Marzulli. They've written about the subject at hand for at least the last couple of broadcasts. We've been discussing the idea that the ancient gods, if you will, that were so devotedly believed in by the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Greeks, the Romans. All the ancient cultures believed that there were gods circulating around in the atmosphere and bestowing their goodness unto man. Well, we have an equally persuasive myth today, and that is that there are aliens from outer space coming down to give man perhaps a blessing, if you will. We don't necessarily believe that to be true. In fact, far from it. But, gentlemen, that's where we've sort of headed toward, and we are now there, that maybe we're seeing exactly what used to happen in the old world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, the Royal Academy that we referred to earlier, as a follow-up to that, of course, Stephen Hawking,
yes.
Famous physicist, has been one of a few of the voices following up on that, saying, you know, if they're really out there, it might not be so smart to be ringing the bell saying, here we are, come and have us for dinner.
You know, Stephen Hawking has nothing to do but sit and think, and a brilliant, brilliant mathematician. And, of course, he deals with cosmology 24/7. And he's come up with some amazing mathematical theories. But when he begins to speak authoritatively about aliens, visitors from outer space, suggesting that maybe they wouldn't be friendly, you've got to sit up and take notice, right?
I would say a resounding yes to that. And simply because this is one of the greatest minds that have ever been on the planet.
Yeah.
And he's explored and plumbed the depths of the idea of extraterrestrial life. And unlike the exopolitic crowd, which is running to embrace so-called ET as our progenitors, as those who are responsible for creating all life on this planet and creating civilizations and the ancient astronaut theory, he's sending up a flare, he's sending up a warning. And I think it would behoove the church at large to listen to that warning. And he's really only touching the tip of the iceberg, which I'm sure we're going to get more into the depths of that iceberg and what's really underneath the surface.
I'm sure that Stephen Hawking is speaking in terms of evolution. That is, he subscribes to the evolutionary model, I'm sure, rather than the creation model. And he would have to think that these aliens from other worlds evolved even as we humans have evolved. And they've probably had longer to evolve, and therefore they're more brilliant. But with that would come the idea of being more capable of wiping out an enemy. They would have more advanced weapons. They would perhaps view us as we view a farm animal. He's saying, watch it, maybe making friends with somebody who wants to eat you up. And I can understand the logic of that, but it's all based on the idea of evolution. Now, we don't subscribe to evolution. We just subscribe to creation and the fall, which has allowed alien entities to enter into this world's societies, literally since Adam and Eve walked in the garden. And this is strictly a Christian subject. That is to say, we've got to be the experts. We've got to enunciate a policy, if you will, a way of looking at this whole thing that makes sense to other people. We don't shy away from what could be a difficult subject, namely aliens coming in from other planets. Nobody wants to talk about that. They'll think you're crazy. But yet you've written about it. In fact, you've written a novel in 3 parts. You've written authoritatively on what happens when these aliens insinuate themselves into our world, and you've written, I think, persuasively on how people react to them. And that's interesting to me. How do people react? I'm talking about the government. I'm talking about academicians, people who are considered the movers and shakers in society. How are they dealing with this?
Well, I think unless a person has a biblical overview and has an idea and has studied what the Bible tells us about fallen angels and about demons and about prophecy concerning those things, and we touched on that, as in the days of Noah, so will be in the Son of Man returns. Unless you come from that paradigm, from that worldview, I think a person is lost. And they are certainly certainly open to the deception from these so-called entities. It's been my understanding, and from my study and my research, that these so-called aliens, which I believe are fallen angels, lie and lie habitually. Jacques Vallée calls them messengers of deception, and titled his book that way. So here's a secular man, Jacques Vallée, with all due respect to Mr. Vallée, entitling his book Messengers of Deception. He's not coming from a Christian worldview,
right,
but he realizes that they lie. And let's just go over something here. If a person lies, they are deliberately obfuscating the truth. They are trying to lead a person away from what is truth. So they have to know what the truth is in order to lie. So that means, taking from that bit of information, I can extrapolate that these entities are malevolent, i.e. evil.
Now, going back a few years to, and we've discussed this on our last program, Roswell, we had the quote-unquote alien landing, which is still classified above top secret, and the reaction of our government was to create a group of intelligentsia to deal with what they consider to be a problem. It was a message problem too, because after all, how do you make yourselves appear credible if A, you've got a spaceship landing and crashing with little green guys on it? How do you make yourself credible? How do you keep your credibility before society? Well, they elected to keep this thing top secret. And B, what really transpired between our government and those aliens? And at that point, a secret panel was convened, usually called MJ-12,
right.
And under the Eisenhower administration, it was called Project Jehovah, and brilliant people, Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Edward Teller, others, were taken into this convocation of minds to try to deal with this problem. And among the questions we now know on their agenda was the problem with cattle that showed up mutilated in a way that couldn't have been done by human beings. As far back as 1953, this group of very superior minds threw themselves at this problem of cattle mutilation. And I believe from that day to this, it's still an open question. And here we can talk about something that I suppose Christians don't usually talk about, but we find that literally hundreds, if not thousands, of cattle have been mutilated in an almost sacrificial way, and nobody has ever yet been arrested, if I'm correct on that.
According to my research, there's the FBI, law enforcement, in the decades that this phenomenon has been going on, continuing, there has not been charges brought against one person. And remember, this is abduction of a person's personal property, trespassing. There's a whole list of offenses that who's ever perpetrating these crimes is committing. And law enforcement now, and I've spoken to people off the record, and they're told by their superiors, don't even go out, just take a report. They just bury the stuff. They know that who's ever doing this, who's ever mutilating the cattle, does so with impunity. They come and go as they please, and no one touches them. And so we're looking at some sort of a intelligence, some sort of phenomena that is beyond anything we know. And of course, I believe it's interdimensional. I believe it reeks of the fallen angels. It is demonic to the nines. It is evil, malevolent. It is satanic.
And the cattle are always found drained of all their blood. They are deprived of certain vital organs, and including the tongue, oftentimes the eyeball, and the surgery is, well, supernatural almost. I mean, for example, a heart removed out of a chest wall without there being any exit wound, a brain removed from a skull, all kinds of amazing things. And what's going on? It appears to be almost a sacrificial or ritual type of operation.
I would concur. If we move away from that phenomena briefly and look at what supposedly happens in satanic ritual abuse, the work of Russ Dizdar echoes this, and he's certainly written about it. The idea of blood sacrifice. When we go back into antiquity, we see that blood sacrifice is used by all the ancient cultures. Just think of the Aztecs and cutting out the heart of it, and of a live human being, and then showing it to them. And the Mayans, and I mean, we go back through antiquity and we see this blood sacrifice. The idea of blood sacrifice. Fast forward to the cattle mutilations, it's the same type of phenomena that's going on. I believe except it's no longer human beings sacrificing to fallen angels or demons. It's the fallen angels themselves creating this mayhem. Do they get? We know from Scripture that the life is in the blood. Mm-hmm. We know that. Abel's blood cries out for the offense because of his murder. That being said, is it possible that these entities, in order to manifest, this is just a scenario. I'm not saying this is exactly what happens. Do they draw sustenance from this? Does that blood give them some sort of a life force which enables them then to manifest in our dimension, in our space-time? We don't know. Is it used in part of the breeding program? Abductees talk about being taken into rooms where these hybrids are in jars. I've written about this. And they see these hybrids in all different forms of gestation. Is the blood, because bovine blood is very similar to human blood, is this part and parcel of the abduction phenomena? Does it all link together? The short answer to that, in my opinion, is yes. It does all link together. But it's so beyond the pale that certainly most Christians don't want to get into this. But we hear from 2 Thessalonians that the fallen one, Satan, Lucifer, comes with all signs and lying wonders. In other words, when he finally manifests on this planet, all the stops are pulled out. He's not messing around. He knows his time is short. And it will be, and this is why I think all this is leading up. It's accelerating. It's moving towards this flashpoint.
Now, these cattle mutilations you're talking about have happened pretty much as top secret events for the last 40, 50 years. That is to say, nobody has ever witnessed a mutilation happening until recently.
Right.
And we find that in England, the shepherds of southwestern England are discovering their sheep being abducted, mutilated, deprived of all their blood, dropped back onto the field.
Same deal.
But the modern shepherds have video cameras, and they've actually photographed lights swooping down over their flocks. They've photographed a sheep actually being lifted up, I understand. Mm-hmm. So they're beginning to make themselves known in a way they have not before. So we know that in the ritual sacrifices of the Jews, the Lord demanded the blood of the lamb. Mm-hmm. And we know that in some way, as you pointed out earlier, the blood has a particular life force that I don't think we as humans fully understand. Mm-hmm. These aliens, and we don't believe in space aliens, by the way. We believe they're exactly the same characters who used to show up in the Old Testament mm-hmm. times under names like Baal and Molech and others. We believe that these aliens then are harvesting blood for their own purposes in almost a ritual way.
Absolutely, it's ritualistic, and that's why I drew the parallel a few minutes ago to satanic ritual abuse. To me, they dovetail, they overlap. The phenomena has so many points of congruence. I think it's alarming. And what is sobering to me is that if it was one or two of these every decade or something, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. But it's not. It's hundreds worldwide, and it happens in certain pockets. Certainly in Colorado, New Mexico, mm-hmm. out in the Southwest, the phenomena continues to this day. Now in England, but in other parts of the world, cattle mutilations. It's real, it's burgeoning, it's not going away. And what the purpose of what's great about this kind of a show is we're sending out a message to people who are watching this, listening to it, and understanding that the enemy is hard at work, and he's got a plan, and he's exercising that plan. And the supernatural is manifesting in today's world in real time. And we need to wake up and understand what's confronting us. And that's what's great about the discussion that we're having here today.
Yeah, and you know, talking about it sounds like somebody may have struck a deal. As I'm listening to Lynn, who's far more of an expert in this, and you are too, on the cattle mutilations than I am, and also perhaps could bring up the subject of human mutilations, which have also been found with the same kind of laser-like removal of a particular kind of body parts. Maybe we can talk about that. Mephistophelian bargain, is that what we're talking about? Because that's exactly part of the record of what the Watchers did the first time. They made a deal. We will trade technology. We will trade secrets from heaven. In exchange, you give us the use of your women and your animals and blood and whatever. And in many of the other cultures, we did a show recently on 2012 talking about the Mayans and how their gods demanded human sacrifice, and that these organs would be removed even while they're alive. They're put on the chalk mule, and their heart is cut out while it's still beating. It is an occultic spirit that, of course, has permeated most of ancient pagan culture, but is there a revival of it now? And back to your question, has our government struck some kind of a deal? Did they do it because maybe they felt they were in a position where they had to? That this power is so much more capable of wiping us out unless, and yet here's the interesting thing. There seems to be, if you agree with the idea that there is a Mephistophelian bargain, then what you're saying is human free will is still operating. That these spiritual forces can only go so far, no further, unless we give them permission. That's almost what Hawkins is saying. Right. In his own way, he is saying, don't reach out and invite them to come here. And we know, of course, through spiritual warfare, for instance, even unsaved people are protected by God. They're protected by His prevenient grace, even unsaved people, so that they will have that opportunity of making a decision to come to Him or to reject Him. If they reject Him, they move closer to inviting these supernatural forces into their life. Is that what we've done under the pretense of high technology? That's an astonishing question.
It is an astonishing question. Tom, let's talk a little bit about principalities, powers, rulers of darkness in heavenly places. That's what Paul called them. To what extent, now, have things changed in the last 50 years? I link this whole thing to Israel's statehood. In fact, to the coming of Israel back to the land. We had, in 1897, the first Zionist Congress. And interestingly, we had a UFO wave in that year. The first big wave of UFO sightings, they were called. 1948, we had another big wave of UFO sightings, Israeli statehood. In 56, during Israel's Great War of the 50s. In 67, the Six-Day War. 73, the Yom Kippur War. Every one of these events in the growth of modern Israel has witnessed an outbreak of UFO activity as though somebody's watching Israel. To me, there are no coincidences. To me, this is something that has happened for a reason, and this, to me, puts these aliens squarely in the camp of the spiritual creatures the Bible talks about, and not in the camp of visitors from other worlds.
And not long ago, you wrote an article for Prophecy in the News magazine. And I can't quote the statement exactly, but you said that it was under the conditions in which God's Holy Spirit, through the church, I assume, is being diminished on earth, and that as that happens, this pressing darkness seems to be pushing through, that black awakening that Dizdar talks about. And as a result, we're seeing more and more manifestations of what is directly, I think, related to, connected to, occult activity, these blood sacrifices. Isn't it interesting that when you're talking about cattle mutilations and potentially human mutilations as well, that these are the same kind of sacrifices that the ancient pagan gods especially preferred? Bulls, sheep, human sacrifices. Why would that be being reflected in phenomenology that's occurring around us today? And one other question I wanted to ask either of you as experts is that a moment ago, L.A. mentioned that he believed that this was, the reason there's no blood on the ground around. There's no footprints leading to or away from. There's no car tracks driving up. These things just appear. Organs are removed with maybe even more than medical precision.
Yes.
And there's no explanation for it. It smacks of interdimensionality, that something's moving in and out of our reality to accumulate this DNA. And it raised, while you were talking, what I wrote down was, what is Bigfoot? What is the Loch Ness Monster? How can these things have been seen by so many people so many times that you go into the lakes with sonar equipment, you can't track them down? Once in a while you'll get a giant blip even. You're tracking something. Then suddenly it's gone. What are we talking about?
Yeah, we're talking about a multidimensional creation here. And you mentioned it earlier, I think, on our last program, the second heaven. The Bible talks about three heavens, and that second would be a dimension just beyond our sight. And apparently the spirit world is populated with fallen creatures who can duck in and duck out, do their dirty work, and be gone.
Which is why we're told specifically in the Bible not to indulge ourselves in necromancy or familiar spirits, any of that, because what we're doing is we're popping into the second heaven. We don't belong there. We're not equipped. We can't deal in that dimension. But these entities can and do slip into this dimension. And of course, this is what we're looking at, I believe, that these are not extraterrestrials from Zeta Reticuli or Arcturus or wherever. These are fallen angels manifesting once again on the planet, as in the days of Noah, so will be when the Son of Man returns. It's happening in real time right now, and it's burgeoning. It's not, again, if it was one sighting, once a year someplace, we wouldn't be talking about it. But there, for instance, in 1950, the year I was born, there was one sighting in the month of December. Fast forward to 2009, last year, there were well over 350 reported UFO sightings. Those are the ones that were reported in the same month. 350 versus one in a 60-year time frame, 59-year time frame. That's alarming. So the phenomenon is real, burgeoning, and not going away. And by talking about it and getting this information out, people can make up their own minds as to what is behind this. And of course, we all believe here that this is the work of the fallen one.
The fallen ones who came in the days of Noah, and again, going back to the words of Jesus, which I always love to do, Matthew 24:37, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. We should be encouraged to see all this happening because it tells us where we are in time. It tells us we're close to the coming of the Son of Man.
Amen.
And listen, that excites me. I don't know about you.
Well, and in addition to that, there's also another sign of the days of Noah, and that was that God's mighty men were able to defeat the Gibborim mighty men.
That's true.
That God's mighty men were more powerful. That if young David can run out and say, "You come at me with a sword and a shield, but I come at you in the name of the living God, and with a stone can take down an 18-foot tall," or whatever he was, Nephilim. That's also one of the signs of the end times, so that as darkness continues to get bolder and more intrusive, God is lifting up special people in this day and age who will be able to take the sword of the Spirit.
I think of you guys as special people who have sounded a kind of a warning. L.A. Marzulli, Politics, Prophecy, and the Supernatural. Give us just a thumbnail of what's in this book, L.A.
Basically, it weaves a tapestry, a story between three seemingly unrelated bedfellows, politics, prophecy, and the supernatural. And the quick thumbnail sketch of that is, in this country, we believe in the workings of the miracle of the God-man being born on Christmas, even though December 25th, that's another cyber, I won't get into it. But the bottom line is this: we celebrate this virgin birth, that's supernatural. In Israel, they celebrate the Passover, angel coming over, passing over the firstborn of the Israelis and killing the firstborn of the Egyptians. This is a supernatural event. They celebrate it. In Iran, they celebrate the Mahdi, supernatural events. They celebrate the Quran, Muhammad ascending to heaven on a winged horse. These are all supernatural events that have shaped the body politic, which begs the question, if it happened then, are supernatural events happening now in light of prophecy? And the short answer to that is yes. Supernatural events are happening, and they are not necessarily coloring the body politic, but they link back into ancient prophecy.
In 15 or 20 seconds, Tom, what would you tell the average Christian to be watching for today?
Well, watching for the coming of the Lord, preparing for the coming of the Lord. If they're listening to this show and they're not ready to meet him, these signs say that something imminent is about to unfold.
Amen.
And the world feels it. The world's looking at the year 2012. They're talking about the apocalypse. They're talking about Armageddon. News stories featuring the coming of Armageddon.
The movies that are being made, L.A., the movies you're saying are all about these subjects.
Yeah, we look at District 9, the Avatar movie, the movie Knowing, which was, in my opinion, a frontal assault on Christianity. What we see is that we're being programmed, we're being set up for this coming great deception. It's coming.
It's coming. Gary Stearman reminding you to keep looking up.